So I should clarify what I meant, okay? Um, and I looked this up to be sure. Um, so I know there are some circumstances where it may be unreasonable for an officer to not display, like, and I was talking about, like, literally, like, their state ID. But evidently during a lawful stop, it may be considered unreasonable. May be considered unreasonable for an officer to not identify themselves, even like if a citizen like asks, like, can I see your ID, please? You know, your state ID. If during a lawful stop, you know, depending on how you explain the situation, how the situation is going down, if you think that an unlawful or unreasonable search and seizure may be about to occur, there's something called Penn versus Massachusetts or whatever, or Pennsylvania versus Mims or whatever, where an officer can ask you to step outside of your vehicle if they feel that you are about to hide evidence, or if they feel that their safety is threatened in some sort of way, or whatever. But they would need, you know, exigent circumstances that you are about to hide evidence, or about to floor it, run over their foot, or whatever, something like this. You know, so like your tone of voice. So if they think that you're, but they would be wearing body cams. So if you go in a courtroom and say, Your Honor, I wasn't raising my voice right there, and I didn't have any kind of aggressive posture, whatever. So you have to be careful how you talk to an officer on camera. And if you feel like things are getting out of control, make sure you inform the officer of what you're aware of and what your rights are, and inform the officer, in my personal opinion, what your intentions are. In other words, I've heard of this scenario, or I know this law, I know the statute. Here are my, and you might as well say, here are my intentions are to explain or ask this, or I feel this way, I statements, right? I feel this, or it is my concern this. I feel my safety is at risk, you know? Or I feel confused about this certain scenario. If you feel like that an officer may not be a real police officer, it may undermine public trust if you think you have a weirdo trying to pull you over and rape you, or trying to kill you. And with a person that may have a certain illness, you may end up thinking that for no reason at all sometimes. So an officer that may refuse to show their ID, their state ID, so that you have their name, you know, I think they can cover their ID number or whatever, but, and just like us, they aren't required to like put it up in your face, you know, but within a reasonable, officers shouldn't be acting in any way to undermine public trust. So an officer, if you ask to see their ID in a situation where you may have a reason to do so during a lawful stop, I think in most states it could be considered undermining public trust if an officer refuses to show that ID. But in some states, I think they're only required to show, from what I was reading, their badge number and their ID, and it depends on the state. Some just like, or badge and ID number or whatever, something like this, like next to each other. And I don't know, and I think that would be, yeah, like their badge and ID number, like their police ID number, whatever. And it may undermine public trust. So make sure that you would be polite to an officer. In other words, what I'm saying is that there are rules, you know, and that are violated at times. Sometimes you see people pulled out of cars for no reason at all. So, just because a citizen chooses to contest, I'm not threatening you, officer. I'm recording this scenario. Oh, I don't care. The officer will sometimes pull that person out of the car and just beat them up. even if they're on dash cam, even if they're on body cam, and they'll just do it because they snap. Something happens to some of these officers when they're on the force and they just fucking lose their mind. You know? And some of them may join because they're already crazy. Because they want to kill somebody or they want to hurt somebody. I'm not saying that we should see police officers that way. What I'm seeing is that there is an ongoing pattern that has already undermined public trust. We don't see a lot of that right here, where I'm from. But in the intelligence community, like I've been talking about, yeah, we see a lot of undermining of public trust, I feel. So, in regard to scenarios where it may undermine public trust, for an officer not to display their badge, so evidently a plainclothes officer may be more unless it were compromising an investigation, I guess, in certain public scenarios from what I was reading. And I think it would depend on the situation, but we know this doesn't happen often, but show their state ID. I forgot what I was just reading. You might want to look it up for yourself. But from what I was reading, if it's a situation that would undermine public trust, then an officer could be asked their ID. So what I was trying to say is that you just simply have the right to question your public servants as well. And they should know that that's what they are. Not in a disrespectful manner, but they should not forget that they do work for the community, and sometimes we are treated like it's a privilege, or like we have no right to question these people. We have no right to hold these people accountable, and that's not true. That's not true. And it's accelerating and getting out of control, this pattern of abuse. Like even when we reach out to our own senators, or representatives, they don't fucking reply. I've reached out to my representative and both my senators, they haven't replied to me. They'll even send back, one of them sent back an automated email saying that, if you need help with the federal agency, here's this link or whatever, So I filed a complaint with an IG. Of course, they work for themselves and not the public, so they determined that there was no wrongdoing or nothing had happened or whatever, etc., etc., etc. Well, they're fucking lying. I'm thinking. Yeah. Because what happened to me, the authorities sat back and watched, and they don't want to say anything about it. They don't want to admit it. That's why I'm not in trouble, because they don't want it. For one, I didn't do anything, and they don't want to step into a courtroom with me as I sit there and explain that they watched everything that happened. And I talked to their internal affairs, the FBI. And they just sat there and listened. Because they knew they were guilty. They knew that they didn't want to incriminate themselves by confessing anything, admitting anything. Oh yeah, we knew that. So I don't know what I was thinking, but they're not going to do that. So they just sat there and listened, hoping I would say something out of anger or whatever that they can use against me. Because I am frustrated, but no, I didn't do that. Didn't give them what they were wanting. So what should have been on the other end of that line was somebody working for Internal Affairs that should have done their fucking job and taken my goddamn complaint, FBI, Portland, and I hope you're fucking listening too. Because that's what you should have done. That's how you violate public trust, and you're up there saying we need to restore public trust. You're breaking public trust, because you're fucking breaking the law. You're breaking, that's right, I said it, I'm gonna say it again. You're fucking breaking the law when you don't take my complaint over the goddamn phone when I am talking to your internal affairs. And that's exactly what you did. So I just simply meant to clarify that there are certain situations where it may be considered a violation of public trust if an officer or a federal agent doesn't comply with requests in a certain scenario. And that if we want to talk to a police department or the government and say, hey, I talked to this agent, or hey, I talked to this officer, they didn't comply, or this happened, etc. I think this is out of line. We get to do that. We can do that. But what we see more often than not is we see disrespect. We see being dismissed. We are being treated as if we have to serve them, as if they are not public servants, as if they just have total broad authority over all things and they control us, like they are our overlords. And that's not true. I haven't been treated unfairly by the local police here. I'll give you an example. And I thought this was strange, but for when I was talking to somebody, an officer, I don't know what it was, if it was some sort of test, whether or not, if I knew my rights, but it's no big deal because the officer respected my rights. But I was just, officer came over here because I was having some struggles, or whatever. And officer said, "Can I pat you down? Pretty much check what's in your pockets, or can I pat you down? Can I do a pat search?" And I said, "No, you cannot." Officer said, "Okay." There was no reason for it. There was no reasonable articulable suspicion a crime had occurred, and there was no exigent circumstances. There was nothing in plain sight that would suggest anything at all that I had committed a crime or that a crime was about to occur. So the officer right then and there knew that I knew my rights. Nothing felt right about it. So I said, "No, you may not." And I just wasn't surprised. I was kind of surprised, but I wasn't. Officer said, "Okay." The conversation just kept going. Because there would have been nothing normal about a pat down at that point. And that's what's going on. Is that an officer may try to, if they are a corrupt cop, trying to see if they can just find something just because, they may try to enforce that upon you. I don't know about you, but I call that molestation, rape, unreasonable search and seizure, or whatever. Make sure you know your rights, because they're being taken away.